Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back to our continued exploration of inflation in the economic environment and business strategy course. In the previous session, we discussed what inflation is and how is measured using key indices such as GDP deflator, consumer price index, wholesale price index, and producer price index. Today, we will go one step further. We begin by comparing these different methods, looking at their scope, data sources, coverage, and purpose, and discussing their advantages and limitations. So this comparison will help us understand why multiple indices exist and how they are used differently by businesses, policymakers, and analysts. After that, we will turn our focus specifically to inflation measurement in India, and in that context, we will measure what indices are used officially and what institutional bodies are responsible, and why CPI have replaced WPI as the key benchmark for monetary policy, and what challenges India faces in capturing inflation in a diverse and dynamic economy. So by end of this session, you will have a clear view of how inflation is measured, is tracked in India, why it matters for business strategy and public policy, and how to critically interpret different inflation numbers. So let's begin by comparing the major indices used globally and in India to measure inflation. So let's begin with GDP deflator and consumer price index. So about the GDP deflator, in the previous class we said that this is one of the broadest measure, and GDP deflator, it measures the prices of all final goods and services produced domestically. So it includes consumption, investment, government spending, and exports, but excludes imports. And CPI, it measures the prices of a fixed basket of consumer goods and services purchased by households. However, it excludes investment goods. That means investment goods and government purchases. That means it excludes the purchases made by producers and government, as well as the government purchases also. It is excluded in from CPI. So an increase in prices of consumer goods affects both CPI and GDP deflator. How about an increase in prices of capital goods or government purchases are reflected only in GDP deflator, not in CPI. It's one of the key distinctions here. So I have presented a table to summarize the main difference between GDP deflator and CPI. So in terms of basket, whether includes imports, includes exports, what is the frequency of data collection and use in India. So in the GDP deflator is flexible, changes in the GDP composition, but in the CPI, fixed basket of household goods and services are included. So to summarize this one, how does CPI differ from GDP deflator? GDP deflator measures the prices of a much wider group of goods and services than CPI does, because CPI measures prices of a more limited basket of goods and services, that the only household goods and services that are included in the consumer basket, the consumer basket for a typical households in the country. Second, the bundle of goods in the consumer basket is fixed, same from year to year, while that of the GDP deflator is allowed to vary each year because what is being produced as compared to previous year, suppose this year we are going to produce more new goods and services, that all will be reflecting in the GDP deflator. But in the case of consumer basket, this is already fixed, is already defined in advance, and that will be followed from year after year, that will be followed. CPI includes prices of imports, because in the consumer basket, imported goods also will be included. But in the GDP deflator, only considers goods produced domestically, because you know that GDP deflator has been calculated by nominal GDP divided by real GDP. So in the GDP, you know that there is no imported goods and services are not included there, because GDP has been defined as the market value of goods and services produced in domestic territory of a country. That is GDP. So it excludes import. At the same time, CPI includes price of imported items. So in the case of CPI versus GDP deflator, the basket of goods, as I mentioned, CPI, this one is fixed. At the same time, GDP deflator, the composition of goods changes every year. So what is the implication of this distinction? Suppose there is a major earthquake in Northeast India and it affects the entire tea production. So what is the likely reflection? Suppose assume that we produce tea only in the Northeast and there is a major earthquake, and in the country, suppose the quantity of tea produced because of the earthquake, it becomes zero. Assume that tea is not produced any other parts of the country. So the quantity of tea produced in this particular year become zero, and the price of tea remaining in the market increases. So tea is no longer part of GDP. So what is going to happen? In the GDP deflator, the increase in the price of tea doesn't show up in the GDP deflator. But you know that if the quantity of tea production becomes zero, then we have to import it from the rest of the world. Then that will be expensive. So for the consumers, they are going to pay higher prices of tea. They need to pay. That means their cost of living, the CPI, increases. So since CPI is computed with a fixed basket of goods that includes tea, the increase in the price of tea causes a substantial rise in the CPI. But at the same time, in the GDP deflator, tea completely vanishes, right? The tea is not there, tea and its price is not there. So in that way, if you look at this distinction, you can see that GDP deflator, it underestimates, using this example, in this scenario, it underestimates the true inflation, but the CPI, it reflects the changes in the price because of the tea price. However, there are some problems in CPI. One of the things is that the substitution bias. Since the CPI uses fixed weights, it cannot reflect consumers' ability to substitute towards goods whose relative prices have fallen. Because, for example, for instance, in one of the sessions when we are discussing that law of demand, why demand curve slopes from downward from left to right. In other words, why people demand more when price increases. The point here is that one of the reasons is that when the prices of the product in interest, it declines or it increases, for example, it becomes expensive, its substitute becomes cheaper. So just take an example here. If tea becomes expensive and coffee becomes cheaper, then consumer may switch to coffee. But CPI doesn't capture this, overstating the cost of living. So for example, in the consumer basket, assume that 1 kilogram, for example, 1 kilogram of tea is part of the consumer basket. Similarly, 1 kilogram of coffee is also part of the consumer basket. But if there is, because for example, the earthquake example which you have taken, suppose the tea becomes very expensive, then what is going to happen in the real world? Because this is the basket that we define, but what is going to happen that consumer is going to, for example, now instead of 1 kg, they are going to consume only half kg, and they are going to consume 1.5 kg of coffee. But this one won't be reflected in the CPI. So the substitution bias, it is not incorporated in the CPI calculation. And the second problem with the CPI is that it excludes new goods in the market. For example, the shift from cinema theaters to home entertainment system may not be reflected immediately, thus underestimating consumer choices and value when we are using CPI, because as I mentioned, CPI use fixed basket of goods and services. And it also won't be measuring the quality improvements. So CPI may not fully account for improvements in product quality over time, which affects real purchasing power. For example, comparing a car from 1990 with a car from 2022 in terms of price alone ignores advances in safety, fuel efficiency, and other features. So when we measure in the CPI, we just say car in 1990 and car in 2020. But you know that the car in 2022 is drastically different from the car from 1990 in terms of the features which I just mentioned here. So an important point to remember here, we know that CPI has these drawbacks, then this is the main measure we have been using recently. So the Labour Bureau, the Government of India, attempts to adjust for quality differences in official CPI calculation, but is challenging and not always precise. They make some minor adjustment for these quality differences. So the wholesale price index, this was the main index for measurement for inflation in India till April 2014, but in RBI adopted, in April 2014, RBI adopted a new consumer price index as the key measure of inflation. So combined means, because in India we calculate consumer price index for agricultural labor and industrial workers separately, that is for rural area and urban area separately, and then RBI used the combined measure of CPI for agricultural workers, that is rural area, and CPI for urban area, that is for industrial workers. They use the combined version as the key measure of inflation these days. So the main point here is that until April 2014, WPI was the main index, but since then RBI adopted consumer price index as the main key measure of inflation in the country. And the measuring inflation, one of the uses of measuring inflation is that using this we can calculate nominal interest rates and real interest rate, because every year what we calculate is nominal interest rate. It can be adjusted for the inflation, and this is the formula used for that. And before that, nominal interest rate is the return on investment in current prices, and real interest rate is return on an investment adjusted for inflation. So using the Fisher's equation, we can calculate the real interest rate. Real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus inflation. Suppose the nominal interest rate is, for example, 10%, and inflation is, for example, 3%. Then the real interest rate is 10 minus 3, that is nominal interest rate minus inflation, that is 7%. 7% is the real interest rates. How we calculate this one? By using the Fisher's equation, that is the real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus inflation. Coming a little bit more to how CPI has been calculated in India, the methodology that has been used in India is that we define the consumer basket separately for the agricultural workers and also for the industrial workers. So the number of items included in the CPI basket includes 448 in the rural area and 460 in the urban area. So the items in CPI are divided into 6 main groups. So the main groups, these are the main groups: the food and beverages, pan, tobacco, intoxicants, clothing and footwear, fuel and light, miscellaneous. So it's also given weightage. The largest weightage is given for food and beverages, based on the quantity of consumption. And you know that of all these goods and services, food and beverages occupy 54.18%. That is what we calculate is the weighted CPI. So this weightage is also used in the calculation of the CPI. So if you visit the Government of India website, the consumer price index has been measured in this form way. It measures change over time in general level of prices of goods and services that household acquire for the purchase of consumption. I'm showing you some newspaper clippings and also some clippings from screenshot from some website just to show the inflation rate. So how we calculate inflation is that suppose the inflation rate is 10%. 10% is the inflation. CPI, the inflation rate is calculated, but estimated is 10%. For example, the current month, assume that this is December 2025. Assume that the current month is December 2025. When we see the inflation is 10%, what does it mean? That though we calculate CPI every month, but for the inflation measurement, every month we report the inflation. But what we do that, suppose when we are reporting inflation in 2025, what we do that, you take the CPI in 2025. For example, this one is 100. Sorry, this one is for example 110. And in what we do that, we compare this one with the exactly in the previous year of the same month, that is December 2024. Suppose in the December 2024, CPI was, for example, 100. Then from there, you can calculate. You can calculate that the inflation is 110 minus 100 divided by 100. Right. So you are going to get 10% is the inflation. So similarly, if you want to calculate it for November 2025, then the base year you need to take November 2024. So that means though monthly we are reporting, so but when you calculate the inflation, when we are reporting even monthly also, actually what we are reporting is annual inflation. But actually every month we say next month, suppose there is a slight change is this one, then you may get being, for example, you may be getting 11%. So at that time, what you need to do that accordingly, the respective month in the previous year, you need to take. So retail inflation, some more inflation figures. Here you can see that food inflation. Food inflation is the of the 6 components which we mentioned. The initial component was the food and beverages. So what we report here, food inflation is mainly that component. So this showing separately for the base year 2012. So the using the base year 2012 was the CPI separately for each item. So separately is given for rural and urban is given separately. Then finally we calculate the combined one. So as I mentioned, RBI uses the combined version of the rural and urban CPI. So I'm showing you the inflation and consumer prices movement annual percentage. This is how does it look like. Okay. I'm also showing you some screenshot from about wholesale price index, and this I have taken from Ministry of Commerce. So here also you can see that the primary articles, how they report each items has been reported, fuel and power is reported. So for each and every item, this has been reported here. So you can see the weightage given is also given here. A primary article, the weight is 22.62. So let me now introduce you another related concept, that is core inflation. Core inflation, because sometimes when we report the inflation in the country, we make core inflation versus non-core inflation. So core inflation corresponds to the component of inflation that is likely to continue for a long period. Thus, core inflation captures the underlying trend of inflation and is therefore more stable. Unlike non-core inflation component, core inflation is unaffected by temporary shocks. So, in India, core inflation is generally measured by excluding. So, mainly thing is that we exclude the highly volatile components from the headline inflation. So, the very nature, that food and fuel have been highly volatile. Obviously, that the food inflation is a hot topic, a debatable topic in the country. Similarly, especially petroleum products is actually the petroleum prices are volatile to the international price movements. So these are volatile elements. So from the main inflation calculation, we exclude the volatile component, mainly food and fuel, and the remaining, whatever is left over, that we arrive at the core inflation by removing food and fuel components from the headline inflation. So what we get then after excluding this one from the headline inflation, if you remove the volatile components like food and fuel, then we get the core inflation. So the advantage of core inflation is that it gives us the captures the underlying trend of inflation in the country, say, and it is therefore more stable. So I would suggest you go through this document. It clearly explains various concepts in detail, prices and inflation, how it has been measured in the country. So it gives more in-depth information on this. So let us now see, because now you are familiar with what is meant by inflation and how to calculate it and the different methods used. And now you are clear with all these concepts and the measurement approaches. So what is the really importance of inflation in the business strategy? There are some key linkages. One is called the pricing strategy. Especially for firms, they must adjust prices in line with input cost inflation to maintain profit margin. So in high inflation environment, frequent price revisions may be needed. Furthermore, the firms must adopt a psychological pricing because it becomes important to retain customer trust. What I mean here is that suppose they know that the price is going to increase in the coming days. So what they need to do that instead of increasing the price of their product, suppose the general price level in the economy is going to increase, the input cost is going to increase, then what the firms must do that they, instead of waiting for the last moment to increase the price at a steeper rate, they should gradually increase the price. Or in case if they see that price is going to decline immediately after 1 year, so they should incorporate all these things and adjust and give the consumers only a slight increase in price, or otherwise inform the customer well in advance that because of the input cost, give proper data on the input cost, produce a price index, show this one and publicize it and show that because of that we are compelled to increase the price. So that means they take the customers into confidence, then the firms can retain customer trust. And also for the firms, for cost control and input sourcing, understanding the inflation is a key input. So the rising input prices compel firms to optimize production cost, and also it can shift to more efficient suppliers, hedge commodity prices and substitute raw materials which it is getting more cheaply. Similarly, for wage and contract management also, the understanding of inflation is very vital. Inflation expectation influence wage negotiations as well as vendor contracts. So similarly, long-term contracts with inflation index clauses can be used to avoid future cost shock. In other terms, the wages can be determined, wage contracts can be signed by also incorporating the inflation index clauses. Suppose they know that inflation is going to increase at 5% in the next year. So accordingly, the wage contract for the laborers as well as for the firms, they can sign the wage contract including this 5% inflation index. Similarly, for investment and financial planning also, understanding of inflation is going to be a great help. And finally, to understand the consumer demand sensitivity. For example, persistent inflation can erode real income of the consumers, shifting demand away from premium products. So firms may adjust products lines or offer smaller pack sizes to maintain affordability. So I'm also showing you some other key macroeconomic variables. So I'm only showing the slides. This is just for your information. You don't need to go thoroughly of this. One is called index of industrial production, and second one is index of 8 core industries. Mainly this is one, and there index of 8 core industries. I'm just showing you this, the index of industrial production, index of 8 core industries also shown here in this table. This is just for your information. You don't need to go thoroughly of this one. Since we are discussing several indicators, I thought it's better to show these indicators as well. So what we have done in this session is that we have discussed the pros and cons of different inflation measures, and then we made a comparison, and also then we discussed the inflation measurement in India, and also we made a distinction between core inflation and headline inflation. I hope you got a clear understanding of inflation measurement and its use in India and globally. And thank you for watching this video, and see you in the next session. Thank you.